Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cloud Wars Live, where we explore today's digital revolution by speaking with business executives and thought leaders who are changing how the world lives, works, plays, learns, and dreams. We've got an in-studio episode today with Tony Uphoff, the CEO of Thomas, who's here for another episode of Uphoff on Industry. And Tony's been with us for several months. He's bringing some really good insights, what he and his company with their ThomasNet site and data services are looking into what's happening in the digital industrial world, how that's changing, morphing, and driving some remarkable innovation across industries. So, Tony, thanks for being here.
Hey, Bob, great to see you and welcome everybody. You are in Thomas headquarters as we speak in our modest studio here. This building, the company moved into in 1923. 121-year-old company, and we've been in this building basically since 1923. And talk about technology and innovation. The founder of the company moved into this building because it was the only building in New York City that had steel reinforced floors. And he wanted to be able to control his own printing. And printers back then weighed 2 tons. And so he moved into this building. And theoretically, we've been there ever since. So welcome. And
Thank
it's great
you.
To see you.
No, it's remarkable that a century, and to think back when, the challenges that businesses have today as they think about stuff. One of the things they don't have to think about is I got to have my own printing press here.
Right.
I have to have my own electrical generation plant.
Yeah.
But at the time, that was probably quite cutting edge.
It wasn't uncommon, and literally the company history dates back to during the World War. On behalf of major suppliers, they lobbied the government to get more paper for Thomas because it slowed down the industrial economy because buyers didn't get their directories to be able to make informed purchases from. So it's really, I can go on and on, but the history of the company is really remarkable and still family-owned company, no outside investors, really kind of a remarkable, an American business story, really.
It is, and Tony, just take us another step in that direction too, because what had initially been a classic media company, now you and the other members of the management team here have pushed it forward into a new era of data services and insights.
We've been the leading resource for industrial product and supplier sourcing since the inception. And obviously that was print for many, many years. And Thomas was one of the first companies that went online with early websites, and they experimented with CD-ROM delivery before that. And then over time, what the company realized is not only was it really an online and a technology company, but the amount of data we were starting to capture, primarily to help buyers find exactly what they were looking for and to help suppliers find the right kind of buyers for their products and services. But the data itself has become so incredibly valuable that over time, the company started to evolve into really a data and platform company. So from a print directory to a website to now really a data and platform company. And as a result, when you walk around the halls of this company, you're just as likely to bump into a software developer as you would be somebody that's a data scientist, as you would be somebody who, is producing some sort of actionable content for the industrial market. And what's really fun for us is all that data now being able to access it through some of the tools,
right?
Massive cloud computing infrastructure and different things that frankly we could never afford on our own.
Yeah.
But we can now through AWS and other cloud providers that we work with have access to a crazy amount of data that in turn becomes almost like a window into the industrial economy. Yeah. So it has clearly enabled a remarkable amount of change and evolution for a company like ours, and then are being able to share that in value to our customers.
Yeah. Well, Tony, if I could add one quick add-on to your story there about the building and the steel reinforced floors to support the giant printing machines or printing presses, I guess. So 20 blocks south of here, Google's first New York headquarters, right, was an old bus garage for the Port Authority. So it's this massive building and these sloping floors, they had to be built strong enough to hold buses going up and down through there. And I think sometimes we tend to forget how quickly things change and flip around. And I know there was another one in Philadelphia, 100 miles south of here. There was a big, heavy reinforced building in Philadelphia where during the war they made tanks. So they had to be able to roll tanks up and down out of this building, and it became a data center co-location business.
Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, there's a cliche you've heard many times, Bob, where they talk about, we tend to overestimate how quickly a technology is gonna impact us. But then we tend to underestimate over time the actual impact of the technology. So we say, well, it's going to be the year of whatever the new advanced technology is, and it takes several years for it to play out. But then once it plays out, the impact is far more profound than we ever could have possibly imagined. And it's funny, in the meeting I was in before this one, we were talking about infrastructure. And somebody in the meeting started to talk about infrastructure in the early days of the web to infrastructure today. And if you were to do what we're doing now, we're in terabytes of buyer behavior data. We are, we've got artificial intelligence applications and tools. We've got all kinds of things. If some of that technology had been available in Web 1.0, the amount of cost it would have taken to own the computers and the colos and the storage facilities and all those things would have been cost prohibitive. And it's really remarkable and it's one of the things I'm excited to talk about with you today is what are some of these technological advances starting to enable? Mm-hmm. And can we start to think about where that might go? Yeah. Right. And I think that's, to me, I just see the impact it's had on a business like ours. And we can punch up way up in weight class today. Yeah. Through these enabling technologies, and it's allowing us to think differently about our business. We don't, we certainly have limits like any company, but we don't limit our ideas based on traditional metrics of size anymore, because those things they're not irrelevant. They are certainly still relevant, but the ability to access increments of technology and resources today is so much more cost effective and so much more available that I think over a period of time, it's in a positive way, causing us to think differently about our business, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? We think of our business in a different way because of the enabling technologies.
Yeah, Tony. So one last thought on that. We've got an issue of our newsletter coming out in a couple of days here, and the fundamental idea of it is, if, as you're just describing with your company and a lot of the companies that you deal with and that you help aggregate the data and share it with them and analyze it, interpret it, these industrial companies, if it's true that, every company is now a software company, then what happens to the software companies? Yeah. What do they become? So these evolutionary cycles are hitting not just the non-tech companies, but back to the tech companies. And what is it that, a company like Thomas is going to need in its next wave of evolution that you'll be looking to the outside to deliver, because more and more you're going to be able to make a lot of the types of things you need inside.
Going back probably 2 years ago now, Bob, one of the things that we wanted to do primarily for a cultural, process, if you will, was to help people inside of our company. We've got roughly 300 employees that help build everything we do and serve kind of one of three constituencies. Either we serve what we call a user customer. So these would be buyers that use our platform every day to inform themselves about product sourcing and supplier selection or evaluation. It could be engineers, procurement professionals, what's called MROs in factories and things like that. And then we have an advertising customer. They would be product providers or suppliers, right? And then the third is partners of ours that help us with our business. And we took all 300 employees of the company through a customer success workshop where they had to identify which of those customers that they focus on, and then any potential barriers or friction areas in serving that customer. And I'll tell you what was remarkable about it, Bob, and I didn't see this coming, was a lot of people who had been here a while didn't realize that we weren't leveraging in our own internal business systems. We did on behalf of customers, but we weren't leveraging our own internal business systems in a way that best served our customers and our business. And it was really remarkable. Simple example. Yeah. We were still using on-premise financial software that was so dated and cumbersome and difficult, and an order entry system that was dated. And as we identified that, it was remarkable how many people kind of got the point of irony of cobbler's children. Yeah. Hey, we're doing these fantastic things for our customers. Why don't we start to use this technology? And I use it as a small vignette about how culturally it really helps so many people in our company kind of step back and go, I need to think about the business differently, because they hadn't thought of the enabling technology in what they did in billing or processing a customer order. They didn't think about tech that way. They thought about tech on behalf of the user or tech on behalf of an advertiser. I know that seems like a small thing. It is really changing the way people think. Some of the best ideas we have right now are coming out of functions of the business that you wouldn't think have anything to do with tech or anything to do with product, but they're identifying a business process that we can make better or take the friction out or improve the accuracy of, because they now understand that technologies that are available to us are much more powerful and flexible than they've ever been.
Yeah, it's a great parallel to some of the things that are going on with, not just in a company like yours, from media to platform to data and services like that, the companies you cover, the partners you deal with, everybody's internal value capabilities are changing because the outside world's changing so fast too, Tony. And that's one of the things I think sometimes some companies see that it's not a steady state that they operate in. As they change, they by necessity change who they buy from, who they sell to, who they work with, who they partner with. As those companies are changing, too, it comes back in. So there's need for whether it's an industrial company, a financial services company, healthcare, whatever, to be able to be in some ways like masters of their own destiny and be able to control some of that. As you've said, it affects not just what you sell, what you make, but how you think about who your company is and where it can go into the future. So I know you've got some great things to talk about today. What's top of mind for you?
Well, perhaps as a segue, I pick up on a couple of things you just said, Bob. I think one is you have often used the phrase of what business are you in? And I think to a certain extent, you and I are starting to touch on that, right? And you used to use that as a way of illuminating from a very powerful point of view of, hey, technology is either creating new competitors or it's creating new market opportunities. And it oftentimes, hopefully in a positive way, forces you to stop and say, hey, what business am I really in today? The old example, am I in the train business or the transportation industry or something? That's happening in every industry under the sun today. And I think that's a really fascinating dynamic. Second, I think it's redefining some industries. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I think the other thing is the pace of change. And I think what is really hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around is when you get I'd argue, the twin pillars of technology and globalization, but when you get that in relative orbit, the velocity and pace of change speeds up exponentially. And I think that's it's a very challenging, bit of a cliche, you hear this all over the place, but when you get into the guts of a business today, how fast things are changing and how fast things are moving, and whether that's new competitors or new market opportunities, I tend to think of the new market opportunities more than fear-based competitive dynamics, because I think that's a more powerful way to look at it. But it is amazing. I think what in many cases it's forcing companies like ours to actually make sure that we're rigorously prioritizing, because it's almost like, I don't want to say you can do anything, but there's so many opportunities. You want to make sure that you're prioritizing in a way that makes sense, on behalf of your business.
Well, I think it's funny, Tony, as you described that, the similar context. I'm always puzzled when people say, oh, yeah, well, but that's only true in B2C or something like this. Oh, okay. So, the fuddy-duddies or whatever in the B2B world, they won't be faced with this. And I think it's sort of happening just as fast coming the other direction as those sort of temporary, but I don't think they're so relevant anymore, these constructs of you're B2B and I'm B2C and somebody else is somewhere in between. I think those things are coming down because people want to know, as you were describing earlier, how they buy, where they buy. They want to have a direct relationship, whether there's some intermediaries there at some point. And there's a parallel one that you and I have chatted about before, which is inside a company, this notion of a front office and a back office, right? The stuff that was relegated the back office in calmer, quieter, slower paced days has to come to the forefront. Now, I ask people who still like HR. HR is a back office thing, but what about the war for talent?
Yeah.
And what you were describing with the financial systems you have, they were built for a different time and a different set of needs, and it will touch your customers. Right? How fast you're able to deal with your own internal financials.
Yeah.
It absolutely affects that.
I also think, it's fascinating. One of the things in our market that we see all the time, and we watch it in our data, and we can see the impact of it, is technology is starting to revolutionize the way supply chains work, right? And historically, if you go back through history, if you control the supply chain, right, you kind of control the industry.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think of retail as a good example of that, you go down through various parts of the business. And the biggest challenge you had as a new entrant is you couldn't tap into the supply chain. So he who owned the supply chain could dominate or win a market. Well, the cost of entry into a supply chain is so much less expensive today, but it's also becoming increasingly decentralized. So as a simple example, we have examples of companies that are using ThomasNet and they're stepping into markets that they've never played in. And they're sourcing packaging companies, fulfillment companies, and 3PL, right? Logistics companies. And they're going from very small companies to very large companies in a relatively short period of time. So the days of, well, I can't get into retail, or I can't get into this distribution channel, I can't get into that supply chain. Some of that still exists, as you well know. But I think those barriers are starting to break down a little bit. And I think it creates really a remarkable series of opportunities. And I wouldn't be surprised, and we're certainly seeing in the industrial markets, we may start to see over time a new level of entrepreneurialism where I'm not saying it's easy to start a company, but I think the barriers of entry around being able to source, which has always been the tough thing, and then tap into a supply chain, I think those barriers are coming down. I wouldn't say they're completely down, but I think it's easier today than it's been in the past.
And you take that and combine some of the new technologies that maybe a startup is perhaps in some cases more readily able to weave into what it's doing more quickly like that are really making a difference. So I sure agree with you though on it's an opportunity driven market right now, not one of fear, barriers to entry.
So one of the things that we've been looking at, and I was looking forward to chatting with you a little bit about it. So if you think of this idea of where we are in technology, and we tend to be myopically focused on the industrial and manufacturing marketplaces, is we're spending a lot of time thinking through, based on the data of, the old Wayne Gretzky line is, where's the puck going, and what do we see? What I wouldn't call predictions, but what sort of ideas can we, kind of imagine about where some of the parts of the market are going to go? And we've been spending a fair amount of time looking at the role and the function and the impact of engineering. And if you look in the markets that we operate in, they use the term Industry 4.0, which we've talked about before on Cloud Wars Live, is fundamentally, depending on whose description you want to use, it is the fusion or convergence, if you will, of these remarkable technologies: mobile, cloud computing, digital technology, sensor-based technology, and then that convergence with traditional industrial products and services. So the examples of the average jet engine sending so much data back to the manufacturer of the engine as opposed to the pilot is a great example, and creates maintenance and all kinds of fantastic things. We have a big customer of ours that, believe it or not, makes screws that go into absolutely cannot fail environments. They have sensors in the screws so they can actually communicate back and forth. So we're starting to see this take off. So we're starting to spend some time about, okay, so based on that, where might we see some really interesting innovations in engineering? And we've been looking at things like aerospace engineering. We're now going to open up the ability, as crazy as it sounds, to maybe do things on other planets and connect into things happening outside, the atmosphere of this Earth, and then controlling that engineering from here and reaping the benefit of it.
Yeah, Tony, as you were describing that, I was thinking about, what happens when you sort of slip these earthly bonds. And there was, 15, 20 years or so ago, I was doing something at Carnegie Mellon, and the head of their computer science department was talking about, how did he put it? I think he described it as, he said, in the not too distant future, we'll be able to do remote plumbing in your home, and you won't be bound by the ability of a plumber to get into your home when you're there. And somebody said, no. I said, that'll never happen. I said, it's just too complicated. And he said, I believe we just sent a rover lander to the moon. He said, if we could send something to the moon, we said, we can fix your plumbing remotely. So it's really just like getting past a little bit this sense of constraints that we have. And your point earlier about the opportunity-driven markets.
Yeah. Well, we've been looking at areas where there's big need. So you start to think about things like agricultural engineering, and not historically a space that I spend a lot of time in, and likely you spend a lot of time in. But you look at this, and I think this stat is now there's going to be close to 10 billion people on the Earth by the year 2050. That sounds like a long time away. It's actually not. And so what a lot of these technologies are starting to enable is the way for us to look at growing food in different ways, to growing food in different environments, to creating a completely different way that we think about agriculture. as opposed to having the physical limits that in many cases we still have today. Certain regions of the country or certain environments can only do certain things from a food supply or a food sourcing point of view. So we are just fascinated in trying to understand, where might some of these technologies aid in that. We're also spending a lot of time looking at the medical device industry. And the same thing is happening there. Is these advances in technology are allowing the medical device companies to start to think about applications they couldn't even possibly imagine before. And I think it's going to unleash a whole series of medical diagnostics and medical treatments that we can see hints of this, but I think there's going to be a massive acceleration in innovation in those areas in the near future.
And that, Tony, just two related thoughts on that. I saw this morning that both of these companies based in Europe, but one is a flavors and fragrances manufacturer, and the other is a food. They make food processing equipment. They've just formed. It's not a joint venture, but it's a pretty sweeping alliance. They want to work together more closely in ways that will allow startups to provide tools and services and insights to startups who want to get into this business. So exactly your point about supply chains, these things happening more quickly. We're seeing inside the tech industry some unprecedented alliances of some of the big tech vendors, Oracle and Microsoft and SAP, now Microsoft and ServiceNow. You just had never seen before. So I think these new external realities are forcing some changes inside across companies that might not have seen those capabilities before.
Do you think, Bob, and you touched on this before, as we spend time thinking about these engineering disciplines, and software engineering is one of the disciplines we look at that arguably could get redefined as we watch how these technologies play out. What does that software company of the future look like? I'm intrigued with the point you made earlier is, if and we'd be a very small example of this, but if over a period of time, and let's say a generation, in a decade, this company becomes much more of a tech platform, a data platform company, that says something about the marketplace and how people can adopt similar technologies and deploy them. What does it say about software? Does it suggest that software is going to get more deeply vertical in nature, or software becomes an enabling platform that various types of industries use?
Yeah. I think it'll definitely be both of those, Tony. In some ways, I think one of those small examples of it that we're seeing is it's the Oracle Autonomous Database. And it is a database, as you know, are among the most complex and challenging pieces of software of any kind in the world. And Oracle has been able to create a version of it that now runs almost entirely independently. It doesn't need to have babysitters monitoring it, patching it. And unfortunately, a lot of companies today have not always been as rigorous as they need to be about installing patches and so on like that and updates, which create security vulnerabilities. Well, if this new type of software is able to do that automatically, you remove some of that possibility of human error out of it. It constantly improves and fixes itself, improves itself as it gets better. So I think what we'll see in the future, Sam, is that the software is going to talk to software a lot more without human intervention, make it more intelligent. So in the supply chain area, do you need somebody to type in the software knows this shelf is about to be empty and that supplier has some things ready? Just make more and more of those connections.
We're starting to see some early examples of that. So some of the suppliers that we work with have created, let me call it automated or intelligent systems, so that as somebody would draw down inside a related factory that acquires, products or services from that, as it drawdowns, it automatically replenishes and auto triggers an order and things like that. I was with a company in small company that literally 5 people in the company. It's a startup operation. Fascinating business where they have an automated device that in the oil and gas industry, you have to burn off excess gas, and you do it by a flame. And it has to be, regulated. You have to do this very carefully. They've actually created a device where they can do this and they can monitor it from afar. And they sell basically, it's a box that does this, and they can monitor all the dynamics of this thing. And they can do this from a distance. I mean, it's amazing to me. Seems like a simple application. That's a huge challenge if you're in the oil and gas industry. And it's regulated by the state, and you got to monitor. You got to be very careful how you do with it. I think you're going to just see tons of those examples, and they built enough intelligence into the system, and then it can communicate back to, via software and internet-based technology, it can communicate back to a central location. But I think that idea of the smarter and smarter systems, whether that's taking the application, in proximity and or replenishing. I also think there's so much data now from use that, I would like to see software companies actually being able to come back and analyze our use of particular types of software to improve our company, help us become more proficient or efficient, but also I would imagine, just like we monitor the data of every 2 seconds somebody using our platform, we use that to constantly improve the platform.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of work being done in that area, so they don't, the new SaaS programs and cloud software, you don't want a lot of customization, but you want more configuration of these 100 available things. We noticed that Thomas only uses 82 of them, so let's turn off these other 18, and what within those 82 needs to be improved or enhanced. And Tony, I wanted to mention too, you talked about, your exploratory steps into medical devices. I was talking with some people the other day at the University of Pittsburgh, which has a pretty big medical school there. And they said their faculty now is, I think it's approaching, is it a third, maybe it's even closer to 40% of the faculty are from bioengineering fields.
Interesting.
So not the traditional medicine. And so, because I remember I saw the names of a couple of the people who were speaking at this event, and they were on the medical school faculty, but they were resident within the engineering schools. And I thought, boy, this is obviously knowledge that it's becoming quite a trend. And more and more, that's the direction those things are taking, a new blending of expertise, new outcomes that can happen in that. And I think then it's like we've been talking about here, that the way that triggers a series of changes in everything that happens, what's possible, how it's measured, how it's used, how it's monitored.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's a related topic that I wanted to tee up a little bit too, in addition to the, how are these technologies redefining, certainly in the industrial and manufacturing markets, the businesses that some of these companies are in. It's fascinating to watch some of our customers start to completely rethink, what they could provide, what they could offer, and how they work with companies. We're seeing subscription or partial ownership or shared ownership or SaaS-like models emerging from services industry. Just remarkable stuff that's happening. Other thing that I think is interesting, and it made me think of it when you brought up the university. 2017 was the year that there was another generation in the workforce at the exact same time that was of equal size and weight as the baby boom generation. So as you know, the baby boom generation, largest generation ever created, largest generation ever studied. Every demographic understanding we have was lifted from a study of the baby boom generation. Well, the millennial generation is of equal size and of equal weight in the workforce, almost exactly 50-50 as of 2017. And we've been studying this as well. So what we can see in our use case, it's about 50-50. What we can see is, we know to be true about that generation is they're digital natives. They don't remember a world without the internet. And they're making demands of people that are different. And they're having an influence on companies. And that doesn't mean they're pushing out the other generation. It means they're influencing in a positive way older generations. And we think this is something that's kind of intriguing too, and that perhaps a lot of companies haven't started to think about. And I'm not a fan of millennials or unicorns and, therefore you have to treat them different. I don't buy any of that. That's sold to you by researchers who are trying to take your money. But I do think understanding a multi-generational workforce is an opportunity. And I think if your workforce is multi-generational, by definition, your customer set is too. And we're spending a lot of time talking to our customers of just being aware of that and understanding of it. And it could be as simple as, the millennial generation is not going to put up with a crappy web experience, right? Whereas an older generation might call the 800 number. Yeah, I couldn't find what I wanted on the website, but I'm going to pick up the phone and call these folks to see if they've got it. Yeah. And that's a overly simplistic example. But I think that idea of, I don't want to go so far as to say you're redefining the workforce, but I think we need to start thinking about the workforce in a bit of a different way because it is changing.
Yeah, and Tony, on the other side of that too, there's the generational balance or rebalancing that you described, but also one of the things that Microsoft is doing, this new category of worker called, first line workers, so not first responders, but people who, clerks in retail stores, people in some manufacturers, they've never really had a firsthand experience with technology, but now through mobile phone, they are getting this sort of a sense. And that, again, I think that's one of those other things too that's driving this notion of front office, back office, just blowing that, obliterating it. Everybody in every part of your company is going to have access to an opportunity to create a better experience for the customer.
Yeah.
And I think companies that ignore that are going to do so at their own peril. And Tony, two other quick things I wanted to say about, I think, a great point that you've raised here of this notion of change, and it is forcing companies to change. Who am I? What do I do? What business am I in? How can I continue to impart new levels of value and relevance to the companies I want to do business with, and be open to new types of ideas?
One thing, Bob, I'd pick up on, you've done a fair amount of writing and picking up on that idea of the first line worker, which I think is just absolutely fascinating way of thinking about, I guess for lack of a better term, where value is added, and can we use enabling technologies to add value all the way through I hate this expression, the value chain, but in a way I think of it that way when you describe it. So that perhaps our experience with somebody, the example I always give is I've never seen an industry quite like the restaurant industry, right? So you go into a restaurant, and you ask if they have a table available, they say no. And you say, well, do you have one available at 6:30? No. Do you have one at 7? No. And you're thinking, well, why don't you just tell me when you have one available, right? So there's a great example of enabling technology that's made a really first-line worker horrible experience where these poor people, it's like, and then you're trying to look at the computer with them and determine if they have a table. There's a good example of, that could be easily solved with technology, where I didn't even wander in unless I know you have a table available, or I already know when you have tables available. Simplistic example, but I think it's a powerful one. The other thing I would touch on, you mentioned the enabling technology allowing companies to look at markets and different markets, but also stay relevant. Fascinating conversation with an executive with FW Web Company. At the end of the day, massive distributor, a couple of $1 billion in industrial, like valves and pumps and kind of very traditional products and services. They have a bit of a consumer-facing side of their business too that you can buy through retail. Talking to one of their executives who's retiring after a 50-year career. The company's 150 years old. He's retiring after a 50-year career. So we did an interview with him and sort of said, hey, what can you tell us about the 50-year journey? And he said, kind of what you said. He said, it was an endless battle to stay relevant. And he said through different technology eras, through different phases of the industry, through different economic cycles, is how do we stay relevant to our customers? And whether that's introducing us to a new customer, or satisfying an existing customer, or winning back a lapsed customer. And it really hit me when you talked about that relevancy. I think it's something for us as we leverage technology, but it's also, with all the choices available to a consumer today, and a B2B consumer is increasingly, offered a similar range of choices, is how do we as providers, it used to be you'd lock somebody in and you'd have a moat, and they didn't have much of a choice. So that's how you stayed relevant. You locked them into a contract. Today, that's moats are fleeting, to say the least, and that ability to stay relevant and current, I think, is really an important thing, and it's not always easy.
No, and Tony, you got onto that earlier when you were talking about the need for, I think, more and more companies not to look at the markets they're in as one based on fear, or how do I keep the potential competitors at bay, and I'll start shaving my prices and this and that, so forth. But one of opportunity, this sort of unbridled opportunity. And where do you go for that? I thought I called what I wanted to say, and is right. I don't want to give out exact numbers. I'm much older than you are, as you
significantly, as I'm sure all the viewers.
Yes, as you always tell me too. But I can recall, a long time ago, when the first times I was thinking about buying a car. And one of the things that, whether it's parents or uncles or friends, would say is like, he said, as soon as you drive that car, the lot, you've lost 10, 20, whatever the number was.
Right.
It's gone. Well, now, people say that you've got to, it's kind of like Tesla, and it's a self-learning car and it gets better. Some people say if you handle this the right way, the value can go up. So these things that were just sort of, rock solid, not really gospel, but almost like that we grew up with. And that's just how the world works. Well, it doesn't work that way. I think the changes that are happening there are happening so quickly that it used to be too across industries. This is the industry you're in. And if that industry is booming and you do a half decent job, you'll boom. But if that industry tanks, well, it's a race to the bottom. Well, what about the notion of shifting industries? What about following the money of where the opportunity and the market's going and the innovation is headed and all that? So I think it is such an exciting time here. And I think you come around to the C-suites and some of these industrial companies, manufacturing companies, and the need for them to both continue to do what they've always done so well, which is create great stuff, execute, operate those great things, but now to say, how do I go beyond that to tie in with the aspirations and almost the expectations of people in the 21st century, where a car doesn't lose its value when you drive it off the lot, and everything around us is changing.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point, I think some of the same, if not many of the same laws of physics still apply, right? But I agree with you. It's a time of redefining in many cases, and I know when I talk to many of our customers, boy, the comment I hear more and more often is them really trying to understand what the customer needs are. And it seems like such an obvious thing. Well, don't we all pay attention to customer needs? But if we have a customer and we appear to be satisfying their needs, they're paying the bill and they're continuing to buy from us. But what we hear from a lot of our customers, I think the reason they're so interested in data is they're looking for those early footprints that directionally might indicate a new market opportunity. I'll give you a real simple example of one. One of the categories, we have 72,000 categories that we provide on the platform. It's remarkable. And as I mentioned before, literally every couple of seconds, somebody's evaluating a product or a service. Well, some of those are around pretty heavy duty capital equipment. And while they aren't huge volume, it's not like a $50 million, machine is selling every second, but we can see movement in and around these markets. What we've started to see, which is absolutely fascinating, is companies that really want access to the data, because what they're actually looking for is to enable different financial models. So similar to what you were talking about the auto industry, and if you remember when you first heard the idea of fractional ownership of a car, you're thinking, oh, that's a stupid idea. Well, now you're saying, why didn't I think of this, right? You're seeing very similar things. You're seeing innovation around the idea of how can we provide more access to liquidity or financial instruments that would enable more companies to afford either a portion of a machine or a full machine, right? You look at it from another angle, money is incredibly inexpensive. It's historic lows, and it has been for a sustained period of time. So if you look at you lend money and I lend money, how do I differentiate that? Right? It's the same money. So I guess maybe I could provide slightly better terms than you, but some of that's regulated, and frankly, some of that I'm getting pretty close to the margin line as it is. But if I can find a way of packaging that money that enables multiple people to come in and take advantage of a piece of capital equipment or something like that. So we're seeing some I don't think I would have imagined it in all candor. I should have. But we're seeing some really, really innovative use. And there's a great example where a financial institution, primarily based on looking for growth, and they're serving an industrial market, and they're thinking, hey, we provide loans for capital equipment. Okay, well, what's changing in that? Well, hey, maybe fractional ownership or a SaaS model or some other type of model where they might enable more companies to take advantage of something where it could have been a very finite or smaller marketplace.
And Tony, I think what you're describing here about the shift in supply chains, what seems like if the supply chains are shifting, they're shifting for a reason. It isn't just to make the same stuff a little bit quicker, a little bit cheaper. There's going to be new sorts of things that are available. So there's, the financial model that you're describing. I think there's the capital equipment in a year or 2 or 3 from now is going to be extraordinarily different from what it is today. I think it was it the Hanover Mess 2-3 months ago. Microsoft had a huge presence there. It was very little about Microsoft, but most 80 or 90% of their space was occupied by manufacturing companies, startups that were involved with some of the technology or cloud-based things, from drones to AI to logistical optimization programs like that. So that's I think all those lines about the end of manufacturing and the end of industry and all that is really been quite silly. And it's, I think, bred of that notion we talked about of, we get the sense sometimes that the change is not universal, that it's in pockets, right? In fact, it's gone on everywhere. And there's always going to be a need to build stuff bigger, better, faster, more interesting, more intelligent, more customized,
and being more agile in the process. Two of the categories that have been white hot for years are contract design, engineering design, and contract manufacturing. So these would be, folks that are coming up with concepts, right? Inside companies. Some are good-sized companies, but for whatever reason, they don't want to take on the infrastructure. So they'll hire a contract design firm to engineer all the schematics of this thing, and then a contract manufacturing company to build it for them. Whereas, if you go back 20 years ago, that didn't really exist in the way that we're describing it today. It would have been much more of, boy, can we afford to build it?
Yeah.
Can we afford to buy the machines? Do we have the factory floor space to really get after that? We're finding just, much more agile approaches into the industry. And I know that's really a software term, but I think it's increasingly something that's going to get applied in some of these slow-moving, lumbering industries that, or so people think, that are now moving at much more agile speeds and being able to be much more flexible in tapping market opportunities.
Yeah, and Tony, as we're getting ready to wrap up, can I ask you, was that term, do you think the agile term was born in the software industry and radiated out from there, or did the people in the software industry look at what they're doing and say, you know what, if we're in fact manufacturing software, are we doing it the right way to meet the modern times? We better borrow from what some car companies are doing or other manufacturing companies are doing.
It's a great question. And to your example, the very first time I heard the term youth was actually around the auto industry. Yeah. Some of the stuff that Drucker and others studied about those stages where particularly a lot of innovation happening in Japan around the way they automated factories and the way that they worked, and small teams and different things that they created. That's actually the very first time I heard the term agile, and it wasn't applied to software. It was actually applied to factory, and not just automation, but the way that particularly teams worked, and the idea of managing the team participation and engagement around building and manufacturing. But now it seems like it's been adopted, I guess, by the software industry, certainly.
Well, it has, and the software industry is becoming so big, right? And maybe we had talked about this before, Tony, I'm not sure, but I think it was several months ago that Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, which owns LinkedIn, he said for the first time ever, they have seen in the LinkedIn statistics that non-tech companies are hiring more developers than tech companies are.
Wow.
So the preponderance.
I did not know that. That is fascinating.
Yeah, more developers going into industry than other than outside of tech than into tech. So,
which we should have predicted, Bob. If you think about it, now that you hear that, I'm kind of like, wow, that's amazing. But then I stop and go, well, wait a minute. At the end of the day, and you and I have had a ringside seat on the impact that technology's had, particularly in business, for many years now. We've been very fortunate to watch these dramatic transformations that it's enabled. When you look at that, at some point, you and I used to talk about this of, it changes the business you're in. It doesn't mean you're a quote unquote tech company, but if you're not really, really fluent in technology, and that technology is a core part of your competency, then you're going to get left behind. And that may not be true in 100% of industries today, but boy, it's increasingly true. And I know certainly, as somebody who runs a 121-year-old company that I think has always been technically adept and innovative, but we certainly felt that if we don't continue to stay relevant and current in understanding how to harness and leverage technology to delight our customers, we're not going to be as relevant for the next 121 years as we were in the previous. So,
Tony, can I ask you as a last word question, your response to this, if business people, executives think when you hear them say, oh, that's not who we are, that's not what we do. I think that there are cases where that applies, but more and more, I think that can be a dangerous point of view to have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's funny, I just to try to stay relevant and fresh as a leader, I spend a lot of time, learning and studying and challenging my assumptions. And one of the things that I've returned to over the last couple of years is the study of cognitive bias, because it's so easy we all have it, right?
No, we don't.
What do you mean by that?
Not me.
We've been successful in this particular area, and it's really hard to imagine two things. One is, could that success ever go away or be challenged, or could we apply a similar pattern into another area? And whether you look at that as greed, i.e., I could step into a new market, or fear, we're going to get disintermediated, the same logic is true. And boy, we work really, really hard here, and I'd like to think we're making some progress, but we really spend a lot of time talking about that and challenging it in a productive way of, hey, if somebody comes up with a new idea and it gets shot down really quickly, I find myself stopping and saying, well, hey, let's take a beat on that, right? Let's make sure that, is that just our cognitive bias speaking, right? The other one that we challenge a lot here is sunk cost fallacy. Is, well, we have to keep doing something because we've sunk all this cost in it, or historically we tried this and we sunk all, we can't do it again because it costs too much or whatever. That's another one that I tend to look at and certainly look in the mirror and challenge myself, let alone challenge other execs at the company.
Yeah, and we hope that some of the new tools coming out today, these new types of things, will help us see these different approaches. But the sunk cost thing, I think my brother, the sort of economist guy, he says it's like somebody who swims 2/3 of the way across the English Channel and then says, I can't finish, I'm going to go back.
I remember that one. I love that.
Yeah, it doesn't add up. Well, brother, thank you very much for opening up your studio here at Thomas. It's, as always, Tony, great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Great to see you.
Pleasure. Well, thanks to all of you folks out there who've tuned in with us. We hope you'll come back next time for next episode of Uphoff on Industry. And please share your feedback with me, bobevanspa@gmail.com. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.